Somewhere in Saskatchewan, a man sits in his truck, engine off, windows up. He hasn't moved in 40 minutes. Outside, 10,000 acres of canola stretch to the horizon. Gold and still, the way it always looks right before harvest. He built this over 22 years, not inherited, built, row by row, contract by contract, relationship by relationship with buyers in Shanghai and Guangzhou who knew his name and paid on time. His phone shows a number he hasn't processed yet. Canola futures, down 19%, not from a drought, not from a blight, from a meeting he was never told was happening in a city he's never been to, between two governments who decided without a single phone call to Saskatchewan that $94 billion in agricultural contracts would flow somewhere else now. He doesn't say he's angry. When he finally speaks, he uses two words, not three, not four, two. We're replaced. This is not a trade dispute. This is not a tariff negotiation. What happened between Washington and Beijing in the spring of 2026 was something more deliberate, more architecturally precise, and more expensive in its miscalculation than anything the North American alliance has produced in a generation. In this video, you're going to understand exactly what was decided in that room, why the specific industries targeted read like a surgical strike against one country's economic future, and why the man who received the briefing didn't call Washington, he called Tokyo, Berlin, and Brussels. Because while two of the most powerful governments on earth were drawing new lines around the North American economy, someone in Ottawa had already spent 3 months preparing for exactly this moment. Subscribe now, because this story is still moving, and the next development changes everything. 3 weeks before Air Force One touched down in Beijing, a small delegation left Washington with no press coverage, no official schedule, and no diplomatic announcement. The members traveled separately. They checked into separate hotels. They met in a building that appears on no public registry in the city. 72 hours later, the architecture of what would become the most consequential economic confrontation in North American history had been drafted. Canada was not in the room. Canada was not notified. Canada did not receive the basic diplomatic courtesy that 100 years of alliance and integration might have warranted. What emerged from those 72 hours was a 47-page document released publicly on May 13, 2026, the North American Manufacturing Priority Act. The language is technical. The objective is not. Any company seeking maximum American federal tax incentives was required to locate all strategic production lines inside the United States. Not North America, not USMCA territory. The United States, battery manufacturing, semiconductor fabrication, electric vehicle components, artificial intelligence infrastructure, data centers, defense supply chain inputs. And then Section 14, Paragraph 3, the provision that every corporate legal team on the continent has now read more carefully than any other single clause in recent trade history. Companies relocating strategic production from a USMCA partner nation to the United States within 18 months would receive an additional 15% tax credit on top of existing incentives. Read that again, slowly. Washington was not simply encouraging domestic investment. It was actively subsidizing the extraction of production capacity from Canada, paying companies to leave. Structuring a legal financial instrument whose entire purpose was to drain the manufacturing layer from a country it still publicly called its closest ally. The same day the document dropped, Beijing announced $94 billion in agricultural purchasing agreements redirected from Canadian suppliers to American ones. Soybeans, beef, pork, wheat, gone, not gradually, overnight, and Trump stood in the Great Hall of the People and delivered 4 words that dominated Canadian media coverage for days afterward. Good runs end. That sentence was not improvised. It was chosen, and it landed in Mark Carney's morning briefing with the full weight of what it was, a public declaration that Canada's economic position in North America was being reclassified, not a partner, a jurisdiction whose industrial prosperity could be kept at home in America instead of shared. Here is where the story stops being about policy and starts being about the specific human being who received that briefing, because Washington had modeled a response, A predictable response. The response a career politician manages. Defensive, bilateral, focused on restoring as much of the existing arrangement as possible while absorbing the immediate impact. Carney is not a career politician who learned economics as a tool. He is an economist who spent 3 decades at the absolute apex of the global financial system before entering politics. Governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis. Governor of the Bank of England, the first and only non-British citizen in the institution's 300-year history. 13 years as a managing director at Goldman Sachs in rooms where a single misplaced word costs billions and where the negotiators who have internalized that constraint are the ones whose stillness is more threatening than anyone else's most emphatic statement. He read every page of the Manufacturing Priority Act, every line of the Agricultural Contract Framework. 4 hours, no interruptions. Then he made 3 phone calls, not to Washington. Washington was not on the list, Tokyo, Berlin, and a third capital whose identity has not been publicly confirmed, but whose alignment with everything that followed suggests it was Brussels. The omission of Washington from that initial call sequence was not an oversight. It was the first strategic communication of the entire confrontation. He was not going to Washington to negotiate from weakness. He was building the alternative architecture that would define his negotiating position before Washington had finished processing that its leverage calculation was missing a variable. 48 hours later, Carney walked to a podium in Ottawa. No teleprompter, no notes. And he told the world something that the Beijing summit had not modeled as a possible outcome. The misreading, he said, would be expensive. He was not performing. He was reporting on a strategy already in motion. To understand why the Beijing strategy collapsed under the weight of its own assumptions, you need to understand 3 things with precision. What was actually targeted, what Canada actually sits on, and what 6 simultaneous moves executed without a single press release look like when they land. Start with Ontario. Over the previous several years, Ontario had invested more than $30 billion in electric vehicle infrastructure, not announcements, not feasibility studies, physical infrastructure, battery plants with operational production lines, component manufacturing facilities connected to trained workforces, research corridors linking university engineering departments directly to factory floors, compressing the distance between theoretical material science and commercial production in ways that take years of institutional relationship building to construct. The province was on a trajectory that independent economists were beginning to describe with a phrase that carries specific weight in industrial policy circles: the EV capital of North America. That positioning was attracting international investment. It was generating institutional momentum. And institutional momentum in advanced manufacturing is not a vague concept. It is a compounding asset. Every trained engineer who stays, every supplier who builds local, every research partnership that matures. These are not replaceable on an 18-month timeline, regardless of what tax credit is attached to the relocation offer. The Manufacturing Priority Act's specific targeting of battery manufacturing, electric vehicle components, semiconductor fabrication, and artificial intelligence infrastructure was not a general statement of American industrial ambition. It was a precision instrument aimed at the exact investment architecture Ontario had spent years building. Section 14's additional 15% credit for relocating from a USMCA partner within 18 months was the financial accelerant applied to the specific asset class the targeted industries required. Now go underground. Canada holds some of the largest deposits of lithium, nickel, cobalt, uranium, and rare earth elements on the planet. These are not peripheral inputs to the industries the Manufacturing Priority Act was designed to support. They are the physical foundation without which batteries cannot be manufactured, semiconductors cannot be fabricated, defense systems cannot be assembled, and renewable energy infrastructure cannot be installed at the scale the energy transition demands. Here is the structural contradiction that Washington's quantitative analysts did not fully resolve before the policy was deployed. You can use a 15% tax credit to incentivize a battery factory to relocate from Mississauga to Texas. You cannot use a 15% tax credit to relocate the lithium deposit in British Columbia to Texas. The processing capacity moves south. The material it requires stays in the ground in Canada. And every allied industrial economy simultaneously attempting to reduce dependence on Chinese-controlled mineral supply chains is now looking at Canadian deposits with the focused attention of someone who has just been reminded in vivid terms what happens when a single nation controls too much of a critical supply chain. The Beijing agreements were designed to neutralize this leverage, redirect Chinese investment capital away from Canadian mining projects, accelerate American domestic mineral extraction through emergency industrial authorities. Canadian mining stocks fell 14% in the week following Trump's return. Two major lithium projects in British Columbia lost Chinese financing commitments almost immediately. An internal Canadian government assessment described the projected outcome with the bluntness that classified analysis allows. Canada at risk of becoming a raw material supplier while all value-added production migrated south. Not a supply chain partner, a quarry. That assessment arrived on Carney's desk on the same day he was already 40 hours into building the response. Now watch the 6 moves. Move 1. Canada formally notified the United States Trade Representative that it was initiating a comprehensive USMCA compliance review, specifically identifying Section 14's relocation incentives as potential violations of the agreement's investment neutrality provisions. This was not framed as retaliation. It was processed as a legal and procedural challenge to an international agreement that the United States itself drafted, negotiated, and signed. The compliance review has no scheduled resolution date. It is running. And every corporate legal team evaluating the Section 14 credit has now had to incorporate the review's potential outcome into its long-term capital allocation model. Move 2. Canada announced an emergency expansion of its Critical Minerals Investment Authority, a new sovereign fund capitalized at $40 billion, specifically structured to replace the Chinese investment capital that Beijing's Washington agreement had redirected away from Canadian mining projects. Sovereign funds of this capitalization do not materialize fully structured in 48 hours unless the legal framework, the funding mechanism, and the investment mandate were already prepared before the triggering event. The preparation preceded the trigger. Move 3. Canada announced a bilateral industrial partnership with the European Union, a fast-tracked manufacturing investment corridor that EU trade officials had been drafting for months, waiting for the political moment that would make its announcement both credible and strategically urgent. EU capital began moving toward Canadian industrial assets at the precise moment American policy had created a discount in Canadian asset valuations. Washington created the sale. The buyers who arrived were European. Move 4. Canada signed preferential market access agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Australia for critical mineral supply. 3 of the 4 economies whose industrial futures most urgently require a trusted alternative to Chinese-controlled mineral chains. The agreements were announced in sequence across the week following the Beijing summit, each one adding to a cumulative picture of outward multilateral movement that directly contradicted the bilateral containment logic the Beijing arrangements were built upon. Move 5. Canada released a full economic impact assessment, not a political document, a financial one. The numbers were sourced from Statistics Canada and 3 independent economic research institutions. Over $800 billion in annual bilateral trade. 3.2 million American jobs directly dependent on Canadian supply chains. 41% of total American crude oil imports originating from Canada with no viable alternative source within a 5-year horizon. This document was not written for voters or journalists. It was written for the boardrooms of companies evaluating the Section 14 credit, for the financial analysts covering North American industrials, and for the bond market participants pricing Canadian sovereign risk. It was arithmetic, delivered to the people who read arithmetic most carefully. Move 6 was the one that produced the most immediate, measurable results. Carney personally called the chief executives of 11 major American corporations with significant operations in both countries, not to threaten them, to do the math with them out loud. He walked each executive through what Section 14 relocation would cost in Canadian regulatory cooperation, Canadian resource access, and Canadian market participation. allowing each one to perform for themselves the calculation their own legal and financial teams would eventually deliver anyway, just faster, and with more precision than the corporate process would have produced on its own timeline. When the calls ended, 7 of the 11 companies publicly announced they were pausing relocation reviews pending further regulatory clarity. One company proceeded. That company has since discovered that the 90-day streamlined regulatory approval Washington advertised has, in practice, involved closer to 4 years of actual federal permitting process. The credit was large enough to generate the announcement. It was not large enough to make the full economics of actual relocation work. And the infrastructure, the workforce, and the supply chain connections that Ontario had spent $30 billion and several years building, those could not be replicated in a new American location within the timeline that erased the financial advantage the incentive was supposed to provide. Washington moved the incentive. Canada held the foundation. The numbers have names. $94 billion is not an abstraction when you have been selling canola to the same buyers in Guangzhou for 22 years, when you know the names of the people on the other end of the contract, when the rhythm of your operation in planning, harvesting, shipping, invoicing has been synchronized with a market relationship that predates your children finishing school. Robert Thiessen is 58 years old. He farms outside Regina, Saskatchewan, on land his father broke and that he expanded across 2 decades of careful, unglamorous work. He is not a corporation. He does not have a government relations team or a hedging strategy engineered by a derivatives desk in Toronto. He has a bank relationship, an equipment loan, and a forward contract structure built on the reasonable assumption that the buyers who purchased his canola last year would still be purchasing it this year. On the morning the Beijing agricultural agreements became public, canola futures fell 11% in the first hour. By noon, they were down 19%. Robert did not immediately call his bank. He drove his truck to the edge of his field and sat there for 40 minutes, not frozen with panic, doing the specific, methodical arithmetic of a man who has been managing financial risk his entire adult life and has just encountered a variable that his model had no category for. A variable called "two governments decided this" in a room you were not in and did not consider it necessary to inform you beforehand. When he finally spoke about it, he did not reach for outrage. He used 2 words, precise and final, the way a farmer talks when there is no margin for imprecision. We are being replaced, not undercut, not competed with, replaced. The distinction matters. Competition implies a process you can respond to, improve quality, reduce cost, find efficiency. Replacement implies a decision already made at a level where your participation was never part of the calculation. 3 provinces east, in a manufacturing facility outside Mississauga, Ontario, a different kind of replacement was being calculated. Priya Mehta is 34 years old. She holds a doctorate in electrochemical engineering from the University of Waterloo and has spent 4 years building something that does not have a straightforward equivalent anywhere in North America. Not because the technology is secret, because the workforce competency required to operate it at production scale takes years of accumulated hands-on iterative experience to develop. The kind that cannot be recruited, cannot be imported, and cannot be manufactured by a 15% tax credit attached to an 18-month relocation timeline. When the Section 14 provisions became public, the company's Chinese parent began internal modeling on a potential relocation to Arizona. Priya was not informed officially. She heard through the specific, quiet, accurate channel through which engineers always hear things before management confirms them. A conversation between 2 people who did not realize she was within earshot. Her response was not fear. It was the cold, technical assessment of someone who understands production systems at a level that most of the people making the relocation decision do not. They cannot do this in 18 months. The equipment can be moved, the building can be built, the workforce cannot be replicated. What we have here, the way this team troubleshoots, the way the line supervisors read variants in real time, the institutional knowledge that lives in the hands of people who have run this process through every failure mode it has, that took 4 years to build. You cannot incentivize that into existence. She was correct. the company filed its relocation application. The 90-day streamlined federal approval that Washington had publicly committed to delivering took, in practice, closer to 4 years of actual permitting process. The Mississauga facility continued operating. The workforce Priya helped build remained intact. The $30 billion Ontario had invested over years had produced something that a 15% tax credit could not price accurately, because the people who designed the credit had not fully modeled what they were actually asking companies to walk away from. Robert Thiessen and Priya Mehta do not know each other. They have never been in the same room, but they are the human architecture of the same strategic assumption, that Canada's industrial capacity was a resource to be redirected rather than a foundation that had been deliberately, painstakingly built by people whose names were not in the policy document. The assumption was wrong, and the cost of that wrongness is still being calculated, row by row, line by line. Here is what the scoreboard actually shows. Not the announcement scoreboard, not the press conference scoreboard, the transaction scoreboard, the one that reflects what companies, sovereign funds, and trading partners did with their capital after the initial noise settled and the operational realities of the Beijing strategy made contact with the real world. 7 of 11 American corporations that received direct calls from Carney paused relocation reviews. 2 of 3 Chinese battery manufacturers that announced pivots to Texas and Arizona in the immediate aftermath of the Beijing summit have quietly reinitiated conversations with their original Canadian partners. The reason is not sentiment. The reason is that the Canadian infrastructure was already built, the Canadian workforce was already trained, and the 18-month relocation timeline attached to the 15% credit did not survive contact with the actual federal permitting process it required. 3 European sovereign wealth funds committed a combined $22 billion to Canadian mining projects in the weeks following the summit. Capital that had been observing Canadian assets with interest and waiting precisely for the discount that investment uncertainty would create. Washington's pressure campaign created the sale. The buyers who arrived held European passports and long-term strategic mandates. The consequence of European sovereign capital holding significant positions in Canadian critical mineral production is a different geopolitical outcome from the one the Beijing agreements were designed to produce, because those European governments now have a direct financial stake in Canadian resource development that they will defend in every subsequent trade negotiation. Canada's agricultural exports to China fell sharply in the immediate period following the redirected purchasing agreements. The farm-level pain was real, the futures collapse was real. And within 30 days, Canada had accelerated negotiations with India and Indonesia to absorb the displaced volume at comparable price points. The export market diversification that the displacement forced Canada to execute has produced a more structurally resilient agricultural trade architecture than the single dominant buyer dependence that preceded the Beijing agreements. The disruption was acute. The structural result may prove more durable than what it replaced. A Wall Street analyst note that circulated to every major financial desk on 3 continents summarized the situation with the directness that financial communication uses when the data is unambiguous. The administration appears to have confused Canada's patience with Canada's weakness. The distinction is becoming expensive. Now consider the deepest contradiction at the center of the entire strategy. Washington has said publicly that its goal is Fortress North America, a jointly protected economic zone providing both countries preferential access while presenting a unified front to the global competition that defines this era. Carney has never closed the door on that concept. Ottawa has explicitly said it remains open to deeper North American integration. That openness is genuine and on the record. But Fortress North America requires what any durable institutional partnership requires: predictability, consistency, a partner whose position does not produce 3 completely contradictory communications about the same bilateral arrangement within 11 days. Washington expressed opposition to the January 2026 Canada-China canola agreement, then briefly suggested it was beneficial, then returned to opposition. 3 positions, 11 days. Every Canadian business and government body planning around American trade policy must now account for the possibility that the position communicated this week reverses next week in response to a domestic political development in Washington that has nothing to do with the bilateral relationship. That is not manageable friction. That is a structural barrier to the deeper integration Washington claims to be building toward. The same pressure designed to pull Canada into Fortress North America on Washington's terms is dismantling the conditions necessary for Fortress North America to be politically sustainable within Canada on any terms. The tool is destroying the outcome it was designed to produce. USTR Greer said it plainly under oath before Congress. Canada was doubling down on globalization when Washington was trying to correct for the problems of globalization. That is not a dispute about tariff rates. That is a statement about two fundamentally incompatible visions of how the global economy should organize itself. Those visions cannot be reconciled by adjusting a number by 10 percentage points. 1 week after Air Force One returned from Beijing, a journalist asked the White House press secretary 3 questions in sequence. Whether the administration had calculated what a successful Canadian USMCA compliance claim would cost American businesses. Whether the administration had reviewed Canada's economic impact assessment showing 3.2 million American jobs tied directly to Canadian supply chains, and whether, when the president said Canada's good run was over, that was the official position of the administration on the alliance. The press secretary paused. 4 seconds. The cameras stayed on. Then she moved to the next question without answering. That 4-second pause was broadcast across every major Canadian news organization that evening, placed directly adjacent to footage of Carney at the Ottawa podium. No teleprompter, no notes, complete stillness, saying exactly what he believed with the precision of someone who had prepared every sentence and verified every number before walking into the room. One side knew what it was saying. The other needed 4 seconds to decide what it was permitted to say, and then chose silence. The silence was the answer. And the answer confirmed what the transaction data, the sovereign fund commitments, the paused relocation reviews, and the reinitiated battery manufacturer conversations had already been quietly demonstrating for weeks. They misread the country. They misread the man. And the cost of that misreading is still accruing. In boardrooms, in arbitration filings, in sovereign capital flows, and in the slow, irreversible repositioning of a middle power that spent 3 months preparing for exactly this moment and has not yet finished responding to it. The good run they said was over is still running. Subscribe, because the USMCA compliance review has no resolution date. The next chapter is already being written, and when it breaks, you will want to have been here from the beginning.